بنت العربان يا بوي لهليب ونار يا بوي.
This episode was produced in Arabic and translated and dubbed into English.
السلام عليكم، أهلا بكم في حلقة جديدة من بودكاست.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to a new episode of the Aswatona podcast. I am Mazen, and in this episode we will be talking about the effects of climate change in Sudan and how it impacts people's lives and livelihood. First, let's learn a bit about the geography and demography of Sudan. As a global south country, or one of the less developed countries, Sudan is highly exposed to climate change and its effects. The continuous change in climate and the repeated flooding has increased droughts and caused changes in rainfall. This is accompanied by other problems, such as the disintegration of the ecosystem, unsustainable farming practices, scarcity of natural resources, and the struggles over resources, as well as the economic consequences of COVID-19. Add to that the ongoing political instability, which was aggravated with the military coup in October 2021 and the war between the Sudanese army and rapid support forces on April 15th in 2023, which continues to this day. In addition to all this, there's the rise in inflation, which weakens the state and threatens means of livelihood and food security. More than 65% of the population, especially in rural areas, make their livelihood through farming, which in turn makes agriculture the main financial source of the country. In 2011, 47% of the labor force were hired in the agricultural field. Average annual temperatures are estimated to be between 26 and 32 degrees Celsius. The northern parts of the country witness extremely hot summers, where temperatures are mostly likely to rise above 43 degrees Celsius. It's expected that the average annual temperatures will rise within the range of 1.5 degrees Celsius at best and 2.6 degrees Celsius in the worst-case scenario mid-century. Presumably, temperatures will rise between 1.5 and 3.1 degrees Celsius by 2060 in August, which is the rainy season. As for the dry season in January, temperatures are expected to rise between 1.1 and 2.1 degrees Celsius. The rise in temperatures could contribute to an intensification of droughts due to the increase in evaporation, which decreases soil moisture.
ارتفاع درجات الحرارة وتغلب
The rise in temperatures, the fluctuations in rainfall, the droughts, and floods all have a negative impact on farming, livelihood, and food in Sudan. One of the negative effects particular to climate change is the discrepancy between genders when it comes to natural resources and security threats related to climate change that women and girls face.
تختلف أنماط هطول الأمطار في السودان سنوياً وجغرافياً.
Rainfall patterns in Sudan differ on a yearly basis in different geographies. For instance, the northern areas get almost no rain, while the areas in the Midlands get moderate rainfall rates from 200 mm to 700 mm, and some of the southern areas get above 1500 mm. Expectations around rainfall vary, yet they all point to an increased interannual variability and an increase in seasonal rainfall, as well as an increased frequency in droughts and their severity. The expectations for 2050 point to changes in rainfall ranging from a decrease of 9% and an increase of 9%.
الفقرة الجاية حنتكلم عن الاستغلال السياسي.
In the next segment, we will talk about political and economic exploitation and mismanagement in Sudan. Conflicts in Sudan have been connected to economics and politics, marginalization, lack of social justice, and an exploitation of governance for personal benefits or for the advantage of political parties or ethnic groups. Other important factors to take into consideration are the economic liberalization policies in the 1970s and the encouragement of Gulf investment in extraction of resources in the 1990s. And lastly, the selling of land in 2013 in favor of investors from Khartoum or from outside Sudan at the expense of local communities. I believe that these policies have instigated conflict and forced displacement. This is because financially supported farming was preferred, and it covers immense areas of farmland while using modern farming technologies. Moreover, there was a focus on importing chemical fertilizers, which substitute traditional techniques, leading to the degradation of farmland. Since the beginning of the 90s, natural resources in Sudan were largely controlled by the state security and all kinds and groups of armed militias, in addition to corrupt elites of Khartoum, which Mr. Mansour Khaled has written about in his famous book, The Sudanese Elite and the Addiction to Failure. I personally recommend reading this book for all the information and analysis that can enable us to understand the nature of conflict in Sudan. What also increases the suffering of the locals in the outskirts is the militias and security forces that were formed by the Sudanese government, like rapid forces, who control most gold mines in the Amir mountain area, which had led to water pollution in the state of West Kordofan and the destruction of pastures and all kinds of wildlife.
أدى انفصال دولة جنوب السودان في العام
Areas of social and ecological weaknesses. The seceding of South Sudan in 2011 has led to decrease in Sudan's gross domestic product. Political instability has continued since then, especially after the Great December Revolution 2018, which did not receive much appreciation from neighboring countries or the former regime or the deep state, who have all contributed to economic deterioration and restrictions on people's livelihood. Moreover, the decrease in rainfall has also constricted people's livelihood and increased poverty and caused food insecurity and forced displacement. The transboundary River Nile is the main source of water for 67% of the Sudanese population. Half of the population live directly on the banks of the Nile, which covers 15% of the country's landscape. Those living in these areas experience a weaker water flow because of climate change effects, as the upper Blue Nile basin, in particular, is facing an increase in temperatures and a rise in evaporation rates with a decrease in yearly rainfalls. Furthermore, the need for water that results from the increase in population growth and agricultural development in the states that lie in the Nile basin could aggravate water shortages across the country. The lack of food security affects more than 10 million people in Sudan. This number could double in the coming years, especially after the catastrophic war of April 15th, which to this day is claiming lives and causing the displacement of millions of Sudanese citizens.
ما هي أسباب تدهور سبل العيش في السودان؟
What are the reasons behind the deterioration of livelihoods in Sudan? The floods and landslides that resulted from the heavy rains in 2020 have affected the lives of around 830,000 people in Sudan and destroyed thousands of houses and crops. In the states of North Darfur, Khartoum, Blue Nile, West Darfur, and Sinnar, vast areas of agricultural land were left under floodwater. Also, the Blue Nile state has recorded the highest record for floods in the past 100 years. Sectarian violence and doomed tribalism in Sudan have played a key role in fueling conflicts over the acquisition of natural resources. Water points, especially water from excavations or natural depressions, are hotspots more prone for conflict that could escalate to armed clashes and tribal fights, all because of the environmental degradation and climate change. It's expected that shepherds and farmers will suffer from less water and therefore produce a small amount of food. Conflict and climate change have different effects on men and, of course, women because they control chances offered for education, resources, land ownership, and transportation. Working women in Darfur make up 85% of the working force, and yet they have a very small chance of owning land. In North Darfur, gender discrimination in how natural resources is managed has a negative effect on women getting resources and controlling them, which makes them more vulnerable to the economic effects of climate change.
اقتصادية لتغير المناخ. بعد تدهور سبل العيش.
After discussing the deterioration of livelihoods, let's talk about migration and mobility because of climate change. Almost 3 million people have been displaced within Sudan because of conflict. Until today, millions are still in a prolonged state of displacement since the conflict that took place in Darfur in 2005, despite the Juba Peace Treaty in 2020, which supposedly aims to facilitate their return to their lands and properties. There are practical and legal complications of the conflict that lasted around 18 years. Then, there is the lack of a genuine resolve to stop the bleeding of this war and the return of the same people who have no interest in stopping the war. There is also the return of those who migrated and the war of April 15th between the Sudanese army and the Rapid Support Forces in Sudan. All these factors, in my humble opinion, have increased homelessness and demographic growth and ecological degradation, which destroys any chance of finding sustainable solutions that would permanently end conflict.
تنهي الصراعات إلى الأبد. أخيراً وليس آخراً، ما ممكن نتكلم عن المشاكل من غير.
Last but not least, we cannot discuss such issues without proposing appropriate solutions. So let us talk about recommendations and suggestions from ecological experts and civil society. The United Nations Integrated Transition Assistance Mission in Sudan, UNITAMS, acknowledges the negative effects that climate change has on stability in Sudan. They stress the importance of putting suitable strategies in place through which dangers can be evaluated and managed. This work should be done hand in hand with the relevant authorities, civil society, and regional organizations, as well as in coordination with international and governmental bodies that work on development and the African Union. The United Nations should broaden the scope of its analysis and its cross-border and regional cooperation when it comes to climate risks, with a special focus on transport-related conflict. I would like to humbly add something I find of grave importance. I beg all Sudanese citizens to rid themselves of the foul tribalism and racism that have divided Sudan and still play a role in dividing people socially and intellectually. From this position, I call on civil society organizations, international organizations, and relevant government bodies to carefully investigate this phenomenon. We should learn from other nations who have been through tribal wars and have healed from them, like Rwanda, and fix problematic areas so we can have an aware society that is able to rise and take Sudan forward. Thank you for listening, and hopefully you tune in again for more episodes on the different issues we shed light upon, and which we hope are of interest to you. Many thanks.